Good morning to you all. It is a great opportunity to come and revisit the East Coast. As Meg said, I started in 1983 over in the Motu and systematically worked my way around the whole of the East Cape. Ended up down at Mahia and surveyed literally thousands and thousands of patches of bush and other habitat in order to try and understand what was the resource, what was the extent of the resource, what was left, what was important, and above all, to try and identify places that hopefully people would consider protecting in the longer term. Now, I'm perfectly understanding of the dilemma that confronts all landowners, farmers in particular. I come from a dairy farm in Taranaki, and I first had my battle with a farmer when I was 7 years old. That was my father. When I fenced off a small pocket of native bush on the back of our farm, and he sort of came along and said, "What the hell are you doing?" Sort of took the wire down. By the way, as a side matter, I obtained the barbed wire from the local dump because, you know, I couldn't steal the wire that he had stored in the shed. So anyway, he pulled the fence down, and I went back the next day and put the fence back up. And there was an interesting little, tete-a-tete between my father and I. And in the end, he understood what I was trying to do. And by the time I was ready to leave high school and go off to university, it was pretty clear what my interest in life was. It was actually understanding the native plants and animals that make Aotearoa New Zealand so special. So your challenge is that you are trying to manage a resource in a working landscape, and this is a big challenge. And we've heard some of the comments from Hamish about the difficulties of managing it. And the point about this is, if we are going to be serious about protecting these patches, particularly the ones in the lowland zone, which tend to be quite small, but are inordinately important compared to their size, way out of proportion. So we heard the statistics a moment ago about over 200,000 hectares protected by QEII. Most of that is concentrated in the lowland zone of New Zealand. And the consequence of that is that there is a greater concentration, especially of rare and threatened species, in those pockets than in the estate which is currently managed by the Department of Conservation. To get a sense of the scale of that resource, another way of thinking about it, I always think about it because I come from Taranaki, I know the size of Egmont National Park, which is 33,000 hectares roughly. 6 times that national park is in QE2 Covenant. So that also gives you an appreciation of just how important it is. But to manage it in the long term is going to take a lot of really interesting work. And it's going to take a series of approaches that I think are going to have to be sort of evolved and developed as we go along. Because you're talking about little pockets of bush. To maintain a small pocket of bush in the long term requires that you consider reconnecting. You consider, how do I buffer the patch? Because is it realistic to think 6 hectares is going to stay on the landscape in face of enormous change that is coming, particularly climate change? Because you see, these plants and animals need to move on the landscape and move and adjust as the environment changes. So the best way to help this process is to think landscape scale. So it's not just about the bit of bush on your property, it's the bit of bush on your neighbour's property as well. And it's, can you actually start reconnecting some of the bits? Can you build even small corridors, even if they're focused on the riparian zone, where you're going to get other benefits in terms of protecting water quality? Whatever it might be, you've got to start thinking landscape scale and reconnecting the bits. Because unless that happens, when the changes occur, the plants and animals actually have nowhere to escape to. They need an escape route. They need a connection, and they need to continue to colonise and establish as changes occur. So what you probably don't realise, well, I'm sure some of you do actually because you're land managers, your neighbour's bush is likely going to be the source for some of the plant species that might colonise your patch of bush, because the birds are moving between them. Birds take no notice of any of these, landscape barriers. They don't take any notice of your tenure line or your boundary or whatever. They are moving on the landscape. And so it's about immigration to new sites, losing things, but then recolonisation. So what I'm saying is that we need to consider the landscape scale to make the reconnections, to link things back together, and only then will we have a shot at protecting the native flora and fauna in the long term. Part of that equation is about pest control. We know that possums browse the canopy. We know we're trying to maintain a nice, tight-knit canopy. That's, survival of our native bush is about protecting the canopy, but it's also about protecting the understory, the shrub layer and the ground cover. And things like deer, we heard the comment about deer. Deer and goats or whatever, and New Zealand's native bush simply do not go together. It's a fact of life. They have evolved over millions of years to be non-resistant to the sort of browsing that occurs from ungulates, from things like goats and deer. Yes, they had a little bit of browsing back in the past from the extinct moa, but that was in a completely different type of impact. So for long-term survival of the patches, the pests must be controlled. And for things like deer and goats in particular, the levels of browsing that the bush can tolerate are extremely low. For plants to regenerate and recolonise the canopy, they need to escape the browsing zone. So there are two main modes of survival in the native bush. First is the plant that is entirely shade tolerant and can regenerate under its own canopy and get back up to control the canopy. And then there's the other sort that colonise gaps after there's been environmental damage of some sort. Not the browsing of the possum that I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is wind throw or some other major event that opens up the canopy, damages the canopy and opens it up. And those plants colonise in gaps, and they have quite a high light demand. But in both cases, they cannot fulfil their function unless the browsing animal is controlled. So I believe we're going to go and have a look at a few places today, and we'll be able to look and see this regeneration process either occurring or not occurring. If the regeneration process does not occur, the bush doesn't collapse immediately, but it's on a trajectory to decline. And it's really a matter of how long will it take before the trees that are currently dominating the canopy are no longer replaced. So, okay, it can take a while. It could take tens of years or even hundreds of years in some cases, but the course of that trajectory is inevitable decline and loss of a forest ecosystem. This has been repeated across New Zealand again and again. Once you get into that downhill slide and the canopy starts to break up, it's extremely hard to reverse the trend and to bring back, the original system. So my suggestion for the longer term is that if you are really serious about holding these patches, there is really no debate about trying to control the browsing of the understory, the ground cover, because that is the key to the survival and regeneration of the canopy of the forest. So perhaps just to finish off, I would just once again say what a pleasure it is to be on the East Coast. I flew from Hamilton yesterday at 3:30 p.m. on a day like today, and I spotted every single peak on the East Coast. Starting at Arafona, Mangahomai, I then saw further up the coast, I looked across and saw the Mangawaru Plateau, and beyond that I saw Rokumura, and then beyond that I saw Whanakau and Hikurangi and Pokiamaru, every single one of them covered in snow. I turned the other way and I saw Ruapehu, Tongariro, all of those mountains, and my beloved Taranaki. I could see that as well. I could see the lot. And what I could also see, though, was the way we have systematically removed forest in the lowland zone. And yes, we all do it because we have to make a living. But actually, if we're going to be serious about maintaining what is, I consider, our